The Arizona desert wind carried the scent of blood across Copper Canyon, and Margaret Thompson knew that meant only one thing. Something was hunting, and something was dying. What she discovered limping toward her ranch that scorching August morning in 1883 would challenge everything she thought she knew about survival, loyalty, and the thin line between civilization and the wilderness that surrounded her isolated. Homestead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Thompson had grown accustomed to the relentless heat of the Sonoran Desert, but August of 1883 brought temperatures that seemed to leach the life from everything they touched. The thermometer nailed to her adobe ranch house showed 118 degrees in the shade, and there wasn't much shade to be found on the 200 acres of scrubland she called home. 4 years had passed since consumption claimed her husband Daniel, leaving her alone with nothing but determination and a stubbornness that ran deeper than the ancient wells that sustained life in this unforgiving landscape. Most women would have sold out and returned to the genteel streets of Tucson, but Margaret possessed the kind of iron will that had driven her family from Virginia to the Arizona territory in search of opportunity that couldn't be found in the war-ravaged South. The ranch itself was a testament to human persistence against impossible odds. Daniel had built the main house from adobe bricks they'd made themselves, its thick walls designed to keep the interior cool during the brutal summer months. A covered porch wrapped around 3 sides of the structure, providing precious shade during the hours when the desert sun turned the landscape into a furnace. Behind the house stood a barn constructed from timber hauled 60 miles from the mountains, its weathered planks housing the small herd of cattle that represented Margaret's primary source of income. Water was the constant concern that governed every decision on the ranch. 2 wells provided barely enough for the livestock and household needs, their levels dropping noticeably during the extended dry seasons that could last 8 months. Margaret had learned to read the sky like scripture, interpreting cloud formations and wind patterns that might herald the brief but violent thunderstorms that could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin. Her nearest neighbor lived 18 miles southeast, a grizzled prospector named Henderson, who appeared every few months to trade supplies and share news from the outside world. The nearest town, Mineral Springs, lay 35 miles north along a treacherous trail that wound through rocky canyons where Apache war parties had been known to ambush unwary travelers. The territorial authorities maintained a cavalry post at Fort Benton, but that was a hard day's ride away, too distant to provide protection when trouble arrived without warning. Margaret had adapted to the isolation by developing skills that would have seemed impossible during her pampered youth in Richmond. She could shoe a horse, repair broken harness leather, treat sick cattle, and shoot straight enough to bring down the occasional deer that wandered down from the mountains. Her hands, once soft and pale, now bore the calluses and scars that marked someone who worked with tools and rope and the sharp edges of survival. The Apache had been a constant presence in the territory for as long as anyone could remember, their relationship with white settlers ranging from cautious trade to open warfare, depending on the actions of territorial authorities and the temperament of individual bands. Recent months had seen increased tension as gold prospectors pushed deeper into traditional Apache hunting grounds, violating informal agreements that had maintained relative peace for several years. Just 3 weeks earlier, news had reached even Margaret's isolated ranch of a cavalry patrol that had disappeared somewhere in the Dragoon Mountains, 40 miles to the east. The bodies were found eventually, along with evidence suggesting they'd been tracking a small Apache band before walking into an ambush that left no survivors. The incident had prompted increased patrols and a general warning for civilians to remain alert for signs of hostile activity. But Margaret had learned to distinguish between genuine threats and the paranoid fears that could drive people to see enemies in every shadow. Her experience with the Apache had been limited, but not entirely negative. Twice in the past 4 years, small groups had approached her ranch seeking trade, offering beautifully crafted baskets and pottery in exchange for flour, coffee, and metal tools. These encounters had been conducted with formal courtesy on both sides, governed by protocols that seemed as ancient as the desert itself. The Apache she'd met struck her as intelligent and dignified people who understood the harsh realities of survival in country that killed the unprepared without mercy. They moved through the landscape with an efficiency that white settlers could barely comprehend, finding water where others saw only rock, locating game trails invisible to untrained eyes, reading weather patterns with accuracy that put meteorologists to shame. Yet Margaret also understood the brutal realities that governed frontier life. The same Apache bands that traded peacefully one season might launch devastating raids the next, driven by grievances both ancient and immediate. Young warriors seeking to prove themselves, conflicts over water rights, revenge for perceived injustices. Any number of factors could transform neighbors into enemies overnight. This morning, as Margaret went about her routine chores in the pre-dawn darkness that provided the only relief from summer heat, she found herself thinking about the delicate balance that allowed isolated settlers like herself to survive in contested territory. Success required constant vigilance without paranoid fear, strength without unnecessary aggression, and the wisdom to recognize when circumstances demanded flexibility rather than rigid adherence to principle. She was checking the water levels in the stock tanks when movement caught her eye near the eastern boundary of her property. At first, she thought it might be one of her cattle that had wandered off during the night, but the pattern of movement seemed wrong. Too deliberate, too focused. Margaret shaded her eyes against the rising sun and studied the distant figure. More carefully, someone was walking toward her ranch, moving with the unsteady gait of exhaustion or injury. Even at distance, she could see that the person was struggling, stopping frequently to rest before continuing their approach. Margaret's hand moved instinctively toward the Winchester rifle that was never far from reach, a precaution that had become second nature during 4 years of solitary life in dangerous country. As the figure drew closer, details became clearer. It was a young person, probably a boy, wrapped in what appeared to be a torn blanket or piece of cloth. Blood stained the makeshift garment, and his left leg seemed unable to bear full weight. The way he moved suggested someone pushed beyond the limits of endurance, driven by desperation rather than strength. Margaret's maternal instincts warred with frontier caution as she watched the stranger stumble and nearly fall before catching himself against a fence post. Something about his size and the way he carried himself suggested youth rather than threat, vulnerability rather than menace. But she'd lived long enough in Apache country to know that appearances could be deceiving, that survival sometimes depended on maintaining suspicion, even in the face of apparent need. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the desert air into shimmering waves of heat that distorted vision and made accurate assessment difficult. Margaret wiped sweat from her forehead with her sleeve, never taking her eyes off the approaching figure. Whatever his identity or intentions, the boy was clearly in serious distress. Blood loss, dehydration, and exhaustion were combining to create a medical emergency that would soon become critical without intervention. As he came within 50 yards of the ranch house, Margaret could finally see his face clearly. Her breath caught as she recognized the distinctive features and long black hair that marked him unmistakably as Apache. The boy appeared to be perhaps 13 or 14 years old, his dark eyes holding a mixture of pain and wary intelligence as he studied her across the open ground that separated them. Fresh blood matted the blanket around his shoulders, and his bare feet left dark stains on the sun-baked earth. Margaret's experienced eye catalogued the signs of serious trauma. The way he favored his right side, the shallow breathing that suggested possible internal injuries, the pallor beneath copper skin that spoke of significant blood loss. Her mind raced through the implications of this encounter. Apache raiders had been active in the territory. Cavalry patrols were searching for hostile bands, and territorial authorities had made it clear that any contact with Apache individuals should be reported immediately to military personnel. Harboring or assisting Apache, even wounded children, could be construed as providing aid to enemy combatants. Yet this was clearly just a boy, injured and alone, far from any war party or village. Margaret found herself facing the same moral choice that had confronted humans throughout history, whether to respond to suffering with compassion or to let fear and prejudice determine her actions. "Hello there," she called out, keeping her voice steady while maintaining a safe distance. "Are you hurt?" The boy looked up, and Margaret saw in his eyes the same desperate hope she'd once seen in the faces of wounded animals. The recognition that help might be possible, tempered by the hard-earned knowledge that help often came with a price too. They to pay. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Apache boy raised his head slowly, his dark eyes studying Margaret with the careful assessment of someone who had learned that survival depended on reading human intentions accurately. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, roughened by thirst and exhaustion. "Water," he said in heavily accented English, the single word carrying the weight of desperate need. "Please." Margaret felt her heart clench at the simple request. Whatever else this boy might represent, potential threat, political complication, violation of territorial law, he was first and foremost a child dying of thirst in the brutal August heat. The decision crystallized in her mind with startling clarity. Some moral imperatives transcended political considerations. "Stay there," she called out, setting her rifle aside but keeping it within reach. "I'll bring water to you." She moved quickly to the well, drawing up a bucket of cool water and filling her largest tin cup. As she approached the boy, she could see the extent of his injuries more clearly. 3 deep gashes ran across his left shoulder, the wounds partially clotted, but still seeping blood through the makeshift bandages he'd fashioned from torn cloth. His right thigh bore puncture marks that looked suspiciously like claw marks, and a long scratch along his ribs suggested he'd been in a prolonged struggle with some large predator. "Mountain lion?" Margaret asked as she handed him the cup, noting how his hands trembled with weakness as he accepted it. The boy nodded grimly, drinking the water in desperate gulps before speaking. "Big cat, very old, very smart, killed my horse, tried to kill me." His English was better than she'd expected, suggesting contact with traders or missionaries who taught him the language. "When did this happen?" Margaret asked, her practical mind already cataloguing the medical supplies she'd need to treat his wounds properly. The boy held up 2 fingers, then pointed toward the eastern mountains where the sun had risen. 2 suns passed. Walk long time to find help. 2 days of wandering the desert with those injuries, in this heat, without adequate water. The fact that he was still alive spoke to remarkable resilience and knowledge of survival techniques that few white settlers could match. Margaret realized she was looking at someone who'd been trained from birth to endure hardships that would kill most people. "What's your name?" she asked, crouching down to examine his wounds more closely. "I am called Swift-Running Fox," he replied, formally using the careful pronunciation that suggested he was translating from Apache into English. "Son of Grey Wolf, of the Chiricahua band." Margaret felt a chill of recognition at the tribal designation. The Chiricahua Apache were considered among the most formidable warriors in the territory, led by chiefs whose names struck fear into the hearts of cavalry officers and civilian settlers alike. Yet this boy spoke with the polite dignity she'd encountered in her previous trading encounters, showing none of the hostility she'd been taught to expect from savage Indians. "I'm Margaret Thompson," she replied, extending her hand in the gesture of respect that frontier courtesy demanded. "This is my ranch." Swift-running Fox grasped her hand briefly, his grip weak, but his eyes showing surprise at her willingness to make physical contact. Clearly, his own expectations about white behavior had been challenged by her offer of water and medical attention. "You live alone here?" he asked, glancing toward the ranch buildings with the tactical awareness of someone raised in a world where such assessments meant survival. "Yes, for 4 years now, since my husband died." Margaret saw no point in deception. Her isolated status was obvious to anyone who observed the property for more than a few minutes. The boy's expression shifted to something resembling respect. "Dangerous for woman alone. Desert has many threats." "I've learned to handle most of them," Margaret replied, though she recognized the truth in his observation. "Right now, though, you're the one in danger. Those wounds need proper cleaning and stitching, or infection will kill you faster than any mountain lion." Swift-running Fox studied her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Why do you help, Apache boy? Your people and my people, we are enemies. Your soldiers hunt my warriors. My warriors raid your settlements." The question went to the heart of everything that made frontier life so complex and morally ambiguous. Margaret considered her answer carefully, recognizing that her words might influence not just this immediate situation, but potentially the boy's future attitudes toward white settlers. "Because you're hurt and I can help," she said simply. "That seems more important than politics." "Politics." Swift-running Fox repeated the word thoughtfully, as if testing its weight and meaning. White man's word for choosing sides in fights that don't make sense. His observation struck Margaret as remarkably perceptive for someone so young. She'd often felt that the conflicts between Apache and white settlers were driven more by misunderstanding and fear than by genuine incompatible interests. Both peoples wanted to survive and prosper in harsh country. The tragedy was that they'd been taught to see each other as obstacles rather than potential allies. "Come inside," she said, making the decision that would reshape everything that followed. "Let me treat those wounds properly." Swift-running Fox hesitated, clearly torn between desperate need for medical attention and ingrained wariness about entering a white person's dwelling. Margaret could almost see him weighing risks and possibilities, calculating whether her apparent kindness masked some form of trap. "I have no weapons," he said finally, opening the torn blanket to show that he carried no knife or war club. "Only this." He produced a small leather pouch decorated with intricate beadwork. "Medicine bag," Margaret observed, recognizing the spiritual significance of such items from her previous encounters with Apache traders. "Yes, given by grandmother before she joined the ancestors. Contains herbs for healing, stones for protection, a feather for connection to sky spirits." He clutched the pouch protectively. "All I have left of family." The simple statement carried enormous emotional weight. Margaret realized that Swift-running Fox wasn't just physically wounded. He was spiritually displaced, separated from everything that gave his life meaning and structure. Her offer of shelter represented more than medical aid. It was an acknowledgement of his humanity in a world that seemed determined to deny it. Inside the adobe house, the thick walls provided blessed relief from the desert heat. Margaret cleared space on her kitchen table, spreading clean blankets to create an impromptu medical station. Swift-running Fox looked around the interior with curious eyes, taking in details that revealed how a white woman lived alone in Apache country. "You have many books," he observed, noting the small library Margaret had accumulated over the years. "Reading helps pass the long winter evenings," she explained, gathering medical supplies from the wooden chest where she kept them. "Do your people have written language? We keep stories in memory, pass them from old ones to young ones through speaking. Every story teaches something important about living in harmony with the land and the spirits that protect us." Margaret realized that she was receiving a glimpse into Apache culture that few white people ever experienced. The boy's willingness to share such information suggested a level of trust that contradicted everything she'd been taught about Apache secretiveness and hostility. As she began cleaning his wounds with whiskey and hot water, Swift Running Fox gripped the edges of the table but made no sound of complaint. His stoicism impressed her. She'd seen grown men weep from injuries less severe than what this boy had endured for 2 days. "You're very brave," she commented, beginning to stitch the deepest gash on his shoulder. "Apache boys learn early that showing pain gives enemies advantage," he replied matter-of-factly. "But grandmother taught that accepting help from good spirits is also part of warrior wisdom." Good spirits? Spirits that see past skin color to the heart underneath. Grandmother said such spirits are rare, but very powerful when found. Margaret felt a strange warmth at being considered a good spirit by someone from a culture she'd been taught to fear. It suggested that understanding between peoples was possible when individuals chose to see humanity rather than tribal identity. As she worked, Swift Running Fox began sharing details of his ordeal. He'd been hunting alone, tracking a wounded deer through country that was unfamiliar to him. The mountain lion had been stalking the same prey, and the encounter had been as much accident as predation. "Old cat, very wise, very angry," he explained. "Scars on face from many fights. When it saw me take its deer, it decided I was enemy to be killed." The attack had been prolonged and vicious. Only Swift Running Fox's training in desert survival had allowed him to escape, using techniques passed down through generations of Apache warriors who'd learned to survive in country that offered no margin for error. "How did you know to come here?" Margaret asked as she finished bandaging his shoulder. "Saw smoke from your fire, tracks around water source." Grandmother taught that desperate people must sometimes trust enemies to become friends. The simple wisdom of the statement struck Margaret with unexpected force. She realized that Swift Running Fox had made the same leap of faith that she was making, choosing to risk trust despite everything his culture had taught him about white people. Outside, the desert heat continued to build toward the crushing intensity of midday. But inside the thick adobe walls, 2 people from different worlds were discovering that the barriers between them were more fragile than either had imagined. The boy she'd chosen to help was about to become the bridge between communities that had forgotten how to see each other as anything but enemies. The afternoon heat pressed down on Margaret's ranch like a physical weight, turning the air itself into something that had to be fought with each breath. Swift Running Fox had fallen into an exhausted sleep on the makeshift bed she'd prepared in her spare room, his body finally surrendering to the trauma and blood loss he'd endured over the past 2 days. Margaret checked on him periodically, noting with relief that his breathing had steadied and his fever was beginning to break. She was preparing a broth from beef bones when the sound reached her ears. The rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats approaching. At speed across the hard-pan desert floor, Margaret moved quickly to the window, peering through the gap between wooden shutters to assess this new development. What she saw made her blood run cold. 6 riders were approaching from the south, moving in the precise formation that marked them unmistakably as cavalry soldiers. Even at distance, their military bearing was evident in the way they sat their horses and maintained spacing that would allow rapid deployment if they encountered resistance. The lead rider carried himself with the authority of an officer, his blue uniform stark against the brown landscape. Margaret's mind raced through immediate implications. Had someone reported seeing Apache sign near her ranch? Were they conducting a routine patrol, or had they received specific intelligence about swift-running foxes' presence? Either way, discovery would mean catastrophe for both her and the boy. She'd chosen to help. She moved swiftly to the spare room where swift-running fox lay sleeping. The boy's eyes snapped open at her approach. Even in exhaustion, his survival instincts remained sharp. "Soldiers coming," she whispered urgently. 6 of them, maybe 10 minutes away. Swift-running fox struggled to sit up, his face pale but determined. "I must run. If they find me here, you will be punished for helping Apache." "You can barely stand," Margaret protested, but she was already thinking through options. The root cellar beneath her kitchen offered limited concealment, but searching soldiers would likely find it. The barn was too obvious, and the open terrain offered no escape route for someone in his condition. The storage loft above the main room, she decided quickly. "There's space behind the grain sacks where Daniel used to store winter supplies. Can you climb a ladder?" Swift-running fox nodded grimly, though sweat beaded his forehead from the effort of standing. Margaret helped him up the narrow ladder to the ranch house's loft, then arranged grain sacks and stored blankets to create a hiding space beneath the slanted roof. She handed him a water jug and some dried meat, whispering instructions to remain absolutely silent no matter what he heard below. By the time the soldiers reached her door, Margaret had composed herself and was calmly tending her vegetable garden, as if this were any ordinary afternoon. The knock came firm and authoritative, carrying the sound of men accustomed to having doors opened without question. "Mrs. Thompson," a voice called out, with the crisp accent of an educated Easterner. "Lieutenant, Colonel James Morrison, 4th Cavalry. We'd like a word, ma'am." Margaret opened the door to find 6 soldiers in dust-covered blue uniforms, their horses lathered with sweat from hard riding in the desert heat. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was a lean man in his 40s, with steel-grey eyes and a meticulously groomed moustache. His companions looked younger, nervous recruits who kept scanning the horizon as if expecting attack. "Colonel," Margaret replied evenly, "what brings the cavalry this far out from Fort Benton?" "We're tracking hostiles, ma'am. Had reports of Apache war parties in this vicinity." Morrison's gaze moved past her, taking in the ranch's interior with the practiced eye of someone trained to notice details. "Mind if we come in?" "It's been a hot ride from the fort." Margaret stepped aside, having little choice but to appear cooperative. "Of course. I'll put coffee on." As the soldiers entered, Margaret noticed their eyes cataloguing everything: the layout of rooms, potential hiding places, signs of recent occupancy. One of the younger men, introduced as Sergeant Willis, lingered near the ladder to the loft. "With obvious interest. Seen any Indians in these parts lately?" Morrison asked, settling into Daniel's old chair while his men positioned themselves to observe all entrances. "Can't say I have," Margaret replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "Though I did find some unusual tracks around my water tank. Yesterday morning? Could have been Indian ponies, could have been wild horses." It wasn't technically a lie. She had found tracks, though they'd actually been left by her own cattle wandering back from pasture. Margaret poured coffee for the soldiers while her mind raced through potential complications. "Any tracks this morning?" pressed Sergeant Willis, a burly man with suspicious eyes. "Haven't had chance to check thoroughly," Margaret answered. "Been focused on ranch work since dawn." Morrison sipped his coffee thoughtfully, studying her face with the intensity of someone trained to detect deception. "Understand you've been managing this place alone since your husband passed. Must be challenging, being isolated out here with hostile Indians in the area." The comment seemed casual, but Margaret sensed underlying implications. Was he expressing genuine concern, or subtly questioning why a lone woman would remain in such a dangerous location? "I manage well enough," she replied curtly. "The desert's been my home for 8 years now." "I'm sure it has. Thing is, Mrs. Thompson, These particular Apache we're tracking aren't just hunting game. Morrison stood and moved to the window, studying the view toward the mountains. Intelligence suggests they're scouting for weaknesses in our patrol routes, looking for isolated ranches that might be vulnerable to attack. Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. If the soldiers believed swift-running fox was part of a war, party rather than a lost hunting expedition, the stakes had just increased dramatically. Discovery wouldn't just mean trouble for her. It could cost the boy his life. "You think I'm in danger?" she asked, injecting appropriate concern into her voice. "Could be. That's why we're checking on folks like yourself, making sure everyone's alert to potential threats." Morrison turned back to face her. "You keep any weapons handy?" Margaret gestured toward the Winchester mounted above the door. "Daniel's rifle. I can shoot straight enough to hit what I aim at." "Good. You'll want to keep it loaded and close at hand." Morrison paused, studying her face intently. "Thing is, these Apache are clever. Sometimes they'll send a wounded scout ahead, someone who looks harmless, to gather intelligence about a homestead's defenses." The colonel's words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Had they found evidence of swift-running fox's presence? Blood on the ground, disturbed vegetation, something that indicated an injured person had sought shelter here. "A scout?" she managed, forcing herself to maintain eye contact while her heart hammered against her ribs. "Young brave, maybe, pretending. To be hurt or lost, plays on Christian sympathy while gathering information for a larger attack." Morrison's voice remained conversational, but his eyes had hardened. "You'd tell us if anyone like that had approached your property, wouldn't you, Mrs. Thompson?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying the acrid smell of danger. Margaret realized she was balancing on a knife's edge, with swift-running fox's life and her own freedom hanging in the balance. "Of course I would," she replied, meeting Morrison's stare directly. "I may live alone, but I'm not foolish enough to harbor enemies." The colonel nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with her response. But Margaret noticed Sergeant Willis had moved to examine the floor near the base of the loft ladder, his attention focused on something that made her breath catch in her throat. A small smear of blood where swift-running fox had briefly rested before climbing to his hiding place. "Colonel," Willis called quietly, "might want to look at this." Morrison joined his subordinate, crouching to examine the dark stain on the wooden planks. Margaret's mind raced through possible explanations. A cut finger while preparing breakfast, blood from the beef she'd cooked yesterday, anything that might account for the evidence without revealing the truth. "That's fresh," Willis observed, touching the stain gingerly. "Still slightly tacky." Margaret felt sweat forming despite the relative coolness inside the adobe walls. Above them she prayed silently that swift-running fox had the wisdom to remain perfectly still no matter what transpired below. "Mrs. Thompson," Morrison rose slowly, his hand resting casually on his service revolver. "I'm going to ask you one more time. Has anyone else been in this house recently?" The moment crystallized around Margaret, like desert air shimmering with heat. She could confess, throw herself on their mercy, and hope military justice would recognize the humanitarian nature of her actions. She could lie outright and hope they'd accept her denial. Or she could find a middle path that might protect both herself and swift-running fox. "I cut myself yesterday while cleaning a rabbit I'd snared," she said steadily. "Knife slipped and opened a gash on my palm." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Show me." Margaret extended her hands, palms up, revealing the calluses and small scars that came from ranch life, but no fresh wounds. The colonel's expression hardened as he realized she was lying. "Try again, ma'am." Before Margaret could respond, sounds erupted from outside that changed everything, her dog Rex barking frantically, followed by the terrified lowing of cattle, and the distinctive scream of horses in mortal terror. All 7 people in the house turned toward the windows as an otherworldly roar echoed across the desert. Through the glass, Margaret could see her cattle stampeding toward the barn while Rex circled defensively, snapping at something moving in the shadows near the creek bed. The soldiers' horses reared and pulled against their reins, eyes rolling white with primordial fear. "Mountain lion," Morrison breathed, his interrogation momentarily forgotten as a more immediate threat demanded attention. "Biggest damn cat I've ever heard." At the creek's edge, a massive tawny shape emerged from the scrub brush with liquid grace. The beast paused in full view, its yellow eyes fixed on the ranch house with unmistakable intelligence and malevolent purpose. The mountain lion that had attacked swift-running fox had followed the blood trail, just as Margaret had feared it might. And it was hunting. The mountain lion that emerged from the creek bed was a creature of nightmares made flesh. Margaret estimated its weight at nearly 200 pounds, a giant even by desert standards. Ancient scars crisscrossed its tawny hide, testament to decades of violent encounters with prey, predators, and the harsh realities of survival in unforgiving country. One ear had been torn in some long-ago battle, and fresh scratches across its muzzle testified to its recent encounter with swift-running fox's knife. But it was the intelligence in those yellow eyes that chilled Margaret's blood. This wasn't just a predator following instinct. This was a cunning hunter that had learned to associate human scent with wounded prey. The beast had tracked swift-running fox across 40 miles of desert, following a blood trail that most creatures would have abandoned after the first few hours. "Sweet Jesus," Sergeant Willis whispered from his position at the window. "Look at the size of those paws." The mountain lion placed one enormous front paw on the wooden steps leading to Margaret's porch, testing its weight against the structure. The boards creaked ominously under the pressure. Margaret could see the massive claws extending and retracting as the cat evaluated this new obstacle between itself and its quarry. "Nobody move sudden," Morrison commanded quietly, his earlier interrogation forgotten in the face of immediate danger. Mountain lions don't usually attack groups of people unless they're rabid or cornered, but even as he spoke, the great cat began moving toward the house with purposeful strides. This wasn't defensive behavior or territorial display. This was a hunting approach, methodical and determined. The cougar had followed a specific scent trail to this location, and in its primitive mind, wounded prey waited somewhere nearby. Margaret's blood turned to ice as she realized the full implications. The mountain lion wasn't stalking randomly. It was specifically hunting swift-running fox. And if the soldiers discovered why the predator had come here, both she and the boy would face consequences far worse than military interrogation. "It's coming straight for the door," observed Private Martinez, a young soldier whose voice cracked with nervousness. "Never seen behavior like this before." Morrison moved to Margaret's side, studying the approaching predator with professional assessment. "How long has this cat been in the area, Mrs. Thompson?" "I've seen tracks around the water sources for about a week," Margaret answered truthfully, "but nothing this aggressive before." The colonel's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Tracks around your property specifically, or just the general area?" Margaret felt the trap closing around her again. Every honest answer drew Morrison closer to questions she couldn't safely address. "Around the property. That's why I've been keeping the cattle closer to the barn at night." "Yet you didn't think to mention this when we asked about Apache sign," Morrison observed coldly. "Mountain lions and war parties often use the same water sources and game trails." Before Margaret could formulate a response that wouldn't deepen her predicament, the cougar reached the base of her porch steps. The massive animal paused, its scarred head weaving back and forth as it tested scent patterns with scientific precision. Margaret watched in growing horror as the predator's nostrils flared, focusing on something that had passed this way recently. The beast's behavior was too specific, too targeted to be mere coincidence. It was following a trail that led directly to her front door, drawn by the unmistakable smell of its wounded quarry hiding somewhere inside the structure. From the loft came the faintest creak of floorboards. Margaret's heart stopped as she realized swift-running fox was shifting position, perhaps trying to get a better view of the approaching danger, or simply unable to remain motionless any longer. The sound was barely audible, but in the tense silence of the room, it might as well have been a gunshot. "What was that?" Private Martinez asked, tilting his head toward the ceiling. "Old house settles in the heat," Margaret replied quickly, though sweat beaded her forehead, despite the adobe wall's cooling effect. "Been doing it for years." But Morrison's trained ear had caught something that didn't fit with thermal expansion of timber. His suspicious gaze moved from Margaret's face to the loft ladder, then back again. She could see him piecing together evidence, the blood on the floor, the mountain lion's targeted behavior, the sounds from above. The great cat chose that moment to make its move. With liquid grace that belied its massive size, the predator bounded up the porch steps and hurled itself against the heavy wooden door. The thick planks, seasoned by years of desert sun and reinforced against both weather and potential human threats, held against the initial impact. But the force sent shockwaves through the entire structure, rattling windows and making dust rain from the ceiling beams. Margaret heard timber groaning under stress as the cougar regrouped for another assault. This wasn't just an attempt to force entry. The mountain lion was systematically destroying the barrier between itself and its target. "That door won't hold long," Morrison stated grimly. "Willis, Martinez, help me barricade it. Private Carson, keep that carbine ready." As the soldiers moved to reinforce the entrance, another tremendous impact shook the house. This time, Margaret heard the distinctive sound of wood beginning to splinter. The mountain lion wasn't giving up. If anything, its assault was intensifying. As the scent trail grew stronger, "Why won't it retreat?" Carson asked, his young face pale with fear. "Big cats usually avoid human habitations." Margaret knew the answer, but couldn't voice it. The cougar's behavior made perfect sense if it was tracking specific prey. Swift-running fox's scent filled the house, leading the predator to believe its quarry was trapped and vulnerable inside. The beast would continue its assault until it either succeeded in entering or was driven away by superior force. A third impact sent cracks spiderwebbing across the door's surface. Through the widening gaps, Margaret glimpsed yellow eyes burning with predatory focus and fresh blood matting the fur around the creature's muzzle, evidence of its recent kill of swift-running fox's horse, which had only whetted its appetite. "For more violence, we need to drive it off," Morrison decided. "Mrs. Thompson, is there a back exit from this house?" "Just the root cellar entrance on the north side," Margaret replied. "But it's narrow and leads underground first." "Better than nothing. Carson, check if that route's clear while we hold this." "Position." Morrison positioned himself at the main window, rifle raised. "If this thing gets inside, we'll have a fight in close quarters. Everyone stay calm and aim for center mass." As if responding to his words, the mountain lion launched itself against the door with renewed fury. This assault produced an ominous crack as one of the support boards gave way entirely. Margaret could see tawny fur through the widening gap, and worse, she could see the predator's nostrils working overtime as it caught stronger traces of its quarry's scent. From the loft came another sound, this time unmistakably human. A sharp intake of breath. A swift-running fox reacted to the increasing violence below. The sound was quiet, but in the tense atmosphere it carried like thunder. Morrison's head snapped upward, his eyes meeting Margaret's with the cold certainty of a man whose suspicions had been confirmed. "There's someone up there," he said quietly. "Someone you've been hiding." Margaret opened her mouth to deny it, but another thunderous impact against the door made further deception pointless. The mountain lion's assault had reached frenzied intensity, driven by the proximity of its wounded prey. No amount of explanation could account for such targeted aggression except the presence of the exact person Morrison suspected was hiding. "Above, Colonel," Willis called urgently from his position at the east window. "We've got bigger problems. Look toward the creek bed." Margaret followed his gaze and felt her world tilt on its axis. Emerging from the desert landscape came riders, at least 8 of them, moving in the coordinated pattern of experienced warriors. Even at distance, their distinctive silhouettes and the way they managed their horses in the shimmering heat marked them unmistakably as Apache. "War party," Carson breathed, abandoning his position at the back door. "We're surrounded." Morrison's face hardened as the tactical situation shifted dramatically. "How many?" 8 visible, probably more using the terrain for cover," Willis reported, his voice tight with professional concern. "They're spreading out, trying to get firing positions on multiple sides of the house." Margaret's mind reeled as she realized the approaching riders were likely swift-running Fox's band, finally tracking their missing member to her ranch. What had begun as a simple act of mercy had escalated into a 3-way confrontation between cavalry soldiers, Apache warriors, and a massive predator that seemed determined to break down her door. The mountain lion chose that moment to achieve its breakthrough. Its latest assault opened a gap large enough for the beast to force its massive head through the splintered door. Yellow eyes blazed with triumph as powerful jaws snapped at the empty air, seeking the blood trail that had led it across the desert to this moment. "Shoot it," Morrison commanded, but the angle was wrong for a clean shot. The cougar's body remained, protected by the doorframe, while only its head and shoulders were visible, creating a target too small and too dangerous to risk missing. Margaret found herself moving without conscious decision, grabbing a heavy cast-iron skillet from beside her stove. As the mountain lion struggled to widen the gap with its claws, she brought the pan down with all her strength across the beast's scarred muzzle. The impact produced a wet crack that echoed through the house. The cougar recoiled with a shriek of pain and rage, pulling back through the gap while blood streamed from its injured nose. But instead of retreating, the wounded predator's fury intensified to a level that seemed almost supernatural. It began circling the house with measured strides, seeking alternative entry points while leaving a trail of crimson droplets on the sun-baked earth. Through the windows, Margaret could see the Apache riders had stopped just beyond rifle range, sitting their horses with the patience of experienced hunters while they studied the situation. 7 warriors now, their faces painted for war, but their weapons not yet drawn. They seemed to be waiting for something, but what? Margaret suspected she knew. If this was indeed swift-running Fox's band, they would have tracked his trail to this location. They might even have heard the mountain lion's roars and realized their missing member was in mortal danger. But they also faced armed cavalry soldiers who would likely shoot on sight. The tactical balance was precarious. The soldiers couldn't abandon the house with a mountain lion prowling outside, but they also couldn't ignore the war party that might attack at any moment. Meanwhile, the Apache warriors couldn't approach without risking a firefight, but neither could they withdraw if one of their own was trapped inside. And somewhere above them all, swift-running Fox remained hidden, his presence the key to everything that was unfolding in the desert heat below. The mountain lion's circling had become more systematic, more purposeful. Margaret watched through the gaps in her shutters as the massive predator tested every possible entry point. Windows, the root cellar entrance, even the gap beneath the porch where her water barrels were stored. Blood from its injured muzzle left dark spots on the sand, but the wound seemed only to have intensified its determination rather than weakening it. "This isn't normal behavior," Morrison observed, his military training warring with the evidence before his eyes. "Big cats don't usually persist against fortified positions like this." Maybe it's rabid, suggested Private Carson. Though his voice lacked conviction, Margaret knew better, but revealing the truth would destroy everything. The mountain lion was exhibiting perfectly logical behavior for a predator tracking specific prey. Every instinct told it that swift-running fox was trapped inside this structure, vulnerable and unable to escape. The scent trail ended here, and apex predators didn't abandon certain kills lightly. From the loft came another barely audible sound, fabric rustling as swift-running fox shifted position. Margaret's heart hammered as she realized the boy was probably trying to see what was happening below, unaware that any movement might betray his location to the increasingly suspicious soldiers. Morrison's head tilted upward at the sound, his eyes narrowing with cold certainty. "Mrs. Thompson, I believe it's time you told us exactly who you're hiding up there." The moment of truth had arrived, with the inevitability of a desert storm. Margaret could continue lying and hope for miraculous intervention, or she could trust that honesty might somehow lead to a solution that preserved everyone's life. "It's a boy," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "An Apache boy who was attacked by that mountain lion 2 days ago. I've been treating his wounds." The silence that followed her confession was broken only by the sound of the great cat's claws scraping against adobe walls as it continued its restless patrol outside. Morrison's face cycled through surprise, anger, and calculation as he processed this information. "You've been harboring an Apache," he said slowly, his hand moving toward his sidearm, "in direct violation of territorial law and military orders." "I've been treating a wounded child," Margaret replied firmly. "The same thing I'd do for any injured person who came to my door." Sergeant Willis moved closer to the loft ladder, his carbine held ready. "Colonel, should we bring him down?" Before Morrison could respond, a new sound penetrated the adobe walls, a human voice calling out in Apache. The words carried clearly across the open ground between the house and the waiting warriors, though none of the soldiers understood their meaning. Margaret recognized the tone, if not the language. Someone was calling a name over and over, with the desperation of family seeking a lost member. "They're calling for the boy," she said quietly. Morrison absorbed this information, while rapidly calculating shifting odds. "The boy you've been hiding is related to those warriors outside." "I believe so. He mentioned being separated from his hunting party." The colonel studied her face, reading truth in her expression. 3 cavalry soldiers now faced 8 Apache warriors and a mountain lion, with a civilian woman and wounded boy complicating any military response. Conventional tactics demanded immediate evacuation or calling for reinforcements, but the geography and circumstances made both options impossible. "Can the boy travel?" Morrison asked suddenly. Margaret blinked, surprised by the unexpected question. "Oh, with help, maybe, but those wounds—" "Because," Morrison said grimly, watching the Apache warriors through the window, "I think those people out there might be our only way out of this alive." The admission struck Margaret like lightning. A career cavalry officer was acknowledging that cooperation with Apache warriors offered better survival odds than military confrontation. The realization opened possibilities she'd never dared imagine. But before she could respond, the mountain lion found what it had been seeking. A tremendous crash from the rear of the house announced the beast's discovery of the root cellar entrance. Margaret heard splintering wood and tearing metal as powerful claws ripped away the storm doors that protected her underground storage area. "It's coming through the cellar," Carson shouted, swinging his rifle toward the floor. Margaret's heart hammered as she realized the mountain lion would emerge directly beneath the ladder leading to swift-running fox's hiding place. The predator's hunting instincts were leading it straight to its quarry, through a route none of them had adequately protected. The sound of heavy paws on stone steps echoed up through the floorboards as the great cat began its ascent from the root cellar. In seconds, it would burst through the interior entrance, bringing 200 pounds of muscle, claw, and fang into direct contact with 5 humans, 4 soldiers, and 1 woman who had chosen mercy over military protocol. "Swift-running fox!" Margaret called urgently toward the loft, abandoning any pretense of concealment. "Stay down! Stay quiet!" Morrison's eyes blazed at this confirmation of his suspicions, but more immediate concerns demanded attention. The cellar door exploded upward in a shower of splinters and twisted hinges as the mountain lion erupted through the opening like a force of nature unleashed. The beast was even more massive than Margaret had estimated from external viewing. Its scarred shoulders nearly touched the ceiling beams as it gathered itself in the confined space, yellow eyes sweeping the room's occupants with predatory intelligence. Fresh blood matted its muzzle from Margaret's earlier blow, but the injury had only intensified its rage rather than deterring its attack. Willis fired first, his carbine cracking in the confined space. The bullet scored a furrow along the cougar's left flank without stopping its advance. The wounded predator's roar shook dust from the rafters as it launched itself toward the loft ladder, instinct overriding pain in its drive to reach the source of the blood scent that had drawn it across 40 miles of desert. "Swift-running fox, move back!" Margaret shouted, firing her Winchester at the climbing beast. Her shot struck home, punching through muscle below the cat's right shoulder blade, but the mountain lion's momentum carried it halfway up the ladder before blood loss forced it to release its grip. The great cat dropped to the floor with bone jarring. Impact, landing mere feet from where Carson crouched with his weapon. The soldier's close-range shot caught the predator in the chest, finally eliciting a bubbling snarl as the cougar staggered backward, crimson foam speckling its scarred muzzle. But rather than retreat, the wounded mountain lion's fury reached new heights. It whirled toward Carson with lightning speed, massive paws slashing through the air where the soldier's head had been an instant before. Only Morrison's timely tackle saved his subordinate, both men crashing into Margaret's kitchen table as claws raked through empty space. "It's not going down easy," Morrison yelled, working the bolt of his rifle while keeping the weapon trained on the circling predator. "Thing's too big, too mean to drop from anything but a perfect shot." Margaret realized the horrifying truth of his words. They were facing not just a mountain lion, but an apex predator in its prime, wounded and enraged, but far from defeated. The confined space that should have given them advantage was becoming a death trap, as the massive cat used its superior agility to avoid their shots while positioning for another attack. From above came sounds of movement as swift-running fox responded to the chaos below. Margaret watched in terror as the great cat's scarred head tilted upward, nostrils flaring as it caught fresh traces of its quarry's scent. The predator gathered itself for another leap toward the ladder, muscles bunching under blood-matted fur. But before the mountain lion could launch its attack, a new development changed everything. The rhythmic thunder of approaching hoofbeats penetrated the house's thick walls, growing louder by the second. Through the window, Margaret saw the Apache warriors spurring their horses toward the ranch at full gallop, war cries echoing across the desert as they abandoned cautious observation for direct action. Dust clouds rose behind them as 8 mounted fighters closed the distance with the deadly efficiency of predators responding to the distress calls of pack members. "They're attacking!" Carson gasped, struggling to extract himself from the wreckage of furniture while keeping his weapon trained on the mountain lion. "No," Margaret said with sudden understanding. "They heard the shots. They know swift running. Fox is in danger." Morrison shot her a skeptical look while maintaining his rifle's aim. "How can you be sure they're not using this chaos to overwhelm our position?" "Because," Margaret replied, watching the approaching warriors with growing hope, "they're his family, and family protects family, no matter what uniform you're wearing." The lead Apache warrior reached the shattered porch just as the mountain Lion made its decision to resume its assault on the loft ladder. Through gaps in the splintered door, Margaret glimpsed a lean figure with greying hair and intelligent eyes, his face painted with symbols that radiated both authority and concern. The warrior called out in rapid Apache, his voice carrying both urgency and command. From the loft came an immediate response, swift running Fox's voice, weak but clearly relieved, confirming his presence and condition while his rescue party assessed the situation outside. "What are they saying?" Morrison demanded, sweat beading his forehead as he tracked the mountain lion's restless pacing around the room's perimeter. "I think," Margaret said, raising her voice toward the broken door, "that someone out there wants to help us kill this cat before it kills the boy they've been searching for." Her words hung in the air like desert heat shimmer, carrying implications that could either bridge the gap between enemies or ignite the very conflict everyone had been trying to avoid. The mountain lion crouched low, preparing for another spring. Toward the loft, while outside, Apache warriors took positions around a house where their missing family member lay hidden among the very soldiers who had been hunting them. In that crystalline moment, Margaret realized that survival would require something unprecedented, enemies choosing to become allies in the face of a common threat that recognized no distinction between Apache and cavalry, between desert wisdom and military training. The mountain lion's roar filled the room once more, but this time it was answered by war cries from outside, not cries of attack, but calls of coordinated hunting as warriors prepared to do what they did best, eliminate dangerous predators that threatened their people. The Apache warrior who appeared at Margaret's shattered doorway moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions in hostile territory. Despite the war paint marking his weathered features, his eyes held intelligence rather than bloodlust as he quickly assessed the chaos inside the ranch house. "I am Gray. Wolf," he announced in careful English, his voice carrying the authority of leadership even as he kept his weapons sheathed. "Father of swift-running fox, we come for my son." Morrison kept his rifle trained on the circling mountain lion while processing this unexpected development. "How do we know this isn't a trap? How do we know you won't kill us once the cat is dead?" Grey Wolf's gaze moved from the colonel to the massive predator that continued stalking around the room's perimeter, then up toward the loft where his son remained hidden. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute truth. "Because killing you would not bring my son home safely, and because the woman who protects Apache children has earned honor that transcends the foolish wars of governments." Margaret felt a surge of validation at the warrior's recognition of her choice. But more importantly, she recognized in Gray Wolf's demeanor the same protective instinct that had driven her to shelter swift-running fox in the first place, the universal desire to keep family safe from harm. "Your son is badly wounded," she called out to Grey Wolf. "Mountain lion caught him 2 days ago. He needs medical attention." "Then we kill the cat first, 10 wounds after," Grey Wolf replied with practical efficiency. He whistled sharply, and 2 more Apache warriors appeared at windows on opposite sides of the house, their bows drawn and arrows nocked with professional precision. Morrison's military training warred with tactical reality as he watched enemy combatants take coordinated positions around his location. Every regulation demanded that he treat this as a hostile attack, but the evidence before his eyes suggested something unprecedented. Apache warriors positioning themselves to protect rather than assault. "Colonel," Margaret said urgently as the mountain lion gathered itself for another spring toward the loft. "We can debate politics later. Right now, that cat is about to reach swift-running fox, and we need all the help we can get." The great predator had indeed identified the weakest point in the room's defenses. Despite multiple gunshot wounds, it retained enough strength and agility to reach the loft ladder before the soldiers could bring it down with their remaining ammunition. Only coordinated fire from multiple angles would guarantee stopping the beast before it achieved its goal. Morrison made the decision that would define his career and possibly change the course of frontier relations. "Stand down your weapons," he ordered his men. "We're going to work with them." "Sir?" Sergeant Willis questioned, clearly uncertain about cooperating with hostile Indians. "Sergeant, that's an order. These warriors want the same thing we want, to keep that boy alive and kill that cat. Politics can wait until we're not all about to become lion food." Grey Wolf nodded approvingly at Morrison's pragmatic leadership. "Apache warriors know how to hunt big cats. You have good weapons, but fight in small space like trapped rabbits. We show you how desert hunters kill dangerous predators." Through the windows, Margaret could see other Apache warriors positioning themselves around the house's exterior, creating a coordinated hunting formation that would prevent the mountain lion from escaping once the assault began. Their movements demonstrated the kind of tactical sophistication that military officers rarely credited to savage fighters. The mountain lion chose that moment to make its move, launching itself toward the loft ladder with the desperate fury of a creature that sensed its opportunity slipping away. Grey Wolf's war cry penetrated the thick walls as he coordinated the attack through calls that his warriors understood instinctively. Morrison's rifle cracked simultaneously with the release of Apache arrows from two different windows. The colonel's shot struck the airborne predator in the left shoulder, spinning it partially around in mid-flight. The first arrow punched deep between its ribs, angled upward toward vital organs with the precision that spoke of countless successful hunts. The second shaft struck its hindquarter, hampering mobility but not stopping the beast's forward momentum. The wounded mountain lion crashed against the loft ladder rather than landing cleanly upon it, its claws scrabbling for purchase on wooden rungs slick with its own blood. Margaret heard swift-running Fox's sharp cry of alarm from above as the massive predator struggled to climb despite its injuries. Willis and Carson fired in rapid succession, their shots catching the cat in the chest and neck respectively. But the mountain lion's death throes brought their own danger as 200 pounds of dying apex predator thrashed violently in the confined space, knocking over furniture and sending splinters flying from splintered wood. Margaret grabbed her heaviest poker from beside the fireplace, waiting for an opportunity to deliver a finishing blow that would end the creature's suffering and eliminate the threat to everyone present. The chance came when the mountain lion's struggles brought it within arm's reach. She brought the iron rod down across the base of its skull with all the strength desperation could provide. The impact produced a sickening crack that echoed through the suddenly quiet house. The great cat's yellow eyes dimmed as its massive body went limp, finally succumbing to wounds that would have killed most creatures much earlier in the fight. Blood pooled beneath its scarred hide as the ancient hunter faced its final defeat. In the aftermath of violence, an extraordinary silence settled over the ranch house. Apache warriors and cavalry soldiers regarded each other across a room littered with the debris of combat, all of them processing the unprecedented nature of what had just occurred. "Swift-running fox," Grey Wolf called gently toward the loft. In Apache, his voice carrying the relief of a father whose child had survived mortal danger. The boy's response came weak but steady as he began his careful descent from the hiding place where he'd spent hours listening to the sounds of battle. Below, when he appeared at the top of the ladder, Margaret could see that his wounds had reopened during the stress of the encounter, fresh blood staining the bandages she'd applied. Grey Wolf moved quickly to support his son's final steps, speaking quietly in Apache while examining the medical care Margaret had provided. His weathered hands were surprisingly gentle as he checked the stitching and bandaging, his expression showing professional approval. "You did good work," he told Margaret, with genuine gratitude. "Wounds are clean, healing properly. You have medicine knowledge that honors the healing spirits. Just what I learned from necessity." Margaret replied, though she felt pride at the warrior's assessment. "He's a brave boy. Didn't complain once while I cleaned and stitched the cuts." Swift-running Fox looked up at her with shy gratitude. Before turning to face the soldiers who had been hunting him, Margaret held her breath, wondering how the boy would react to armed representatives of the army that had been pursuing his people. "Thank you for helping to kill the cat," Swift-running Fox said formally, his English more careful in front of his father. "It would have found me in the hiding place without your guns." Morrison studied the boy's earnest face, seeing not the dangerous warrior that intelligence reports had described, but exactly what Margaret had been trying to tell them. A wounded child, grateful for protection from those who could have chosen hostility instead. "You're welcome, son," the colonel replied, his voice gentler than it had been all day. "That was one hell of a big cat. Took all of us working together to bring it down." Grey Wolf translated for the other warriors who had gathered outside the broken door, and Margaret listened to what sounded like explanations and expressions of gratitude rather than war planning. The Apache leader's next words confirmed her impression. "My warriors want to thank soldiers for protecting my son," Grey Wolf explained. "Among Apache, those who help family become part of extended kinship network. This creates sacred obligation." Private Carson shifted uncomfortably at the concept of obligation to Indians, but Morrison seemed more thoughtful. "What kind of obligation?" "Sacred. Debt. You risked lives for Apache, child, when you could have chosen differently. Now Apache must protect you when protection is needed." Grey Wolf's expression grew serious. "This is law older than treaties, stronger than war. Cannot be broken by politics or government orders." Margaret felt a chill of recognition as she realized the implications. Her simple act of mercy had created bonds that transcended political boundaries, establishing relationships that might influence events far beyond this isolated desert ranch. The boy she'd bandaged had become a bridge between worlds that seemed destined for eternal conflict. Morrison absorbed this information, his military mind calculating the potential value of Apache protection in hostile territory. "And this obligation extends to Mrs. Thompson as well, especially to Medicine Woman," Grey Wolf confirmed. "She showed greatest courage by choosing to help enemy child when helping brought only danger to herself. Such spirit walking earns deepest respect among my people." As the implications of their unprecedented cooperation began to sink in, Margaret realized that something fundamental had shifted in the relationships between people who had been taught to see each other as irreconcilable enemies. The mountain lion's attack had forced them to discover that survival sometimes required seeing past surface differences to shared humanity underneath. Outside, the desert heat continued its relentless assault on the landscape, but inside the thick adobe walls, former enemies were discovering that the barriers between them were more fragile than anyone had imagined. The boy she'd chosen to help had indeed become the foundation for something much larger, proof that individual acts of courage could create ripples of transformation that reached far beyond their origins. 3 days after the mountain lions and death, Margaret woke to a sound that made her blood freeze in her veins, the thunderous approach of a large cavalry force moving at military pace across the desert floor. From her bedroom window, she could see dust clouds rising in the pre-dawn darkness, illuminated by torches that suggested a mounted column of significant size advancing with aggressive intent. This wasn't the careful patrol that had brought Morrison and his small unit to her ranch. This was a military expedition designed to overwhelm resistance and restore what higher authorities would consider proper order in the territory. Grey Wolf emerged from the temporary shelter he'd constructed near her barn, his weathered face reading the tactical situation with the professional clarity of someone who'd survived decades of warfare. Over the past 3 days, he and 4 of his warriors had remained at Margaret's ranch, partly to ensure Swift-Running Fox's continued recovery, and partly out of the sacred obligation he'd described to protect those who had protected family. "Time for us to leave," he said simply, moving toward where the Apache horses were picketed. "Army comes in force. They will not listen to explanations about cooperation." But Swift-Running Fox struggled to his feet from where he'd been resting against the porch rail, wincing as healing wounds protested the movement. "No running," he said firmly. "Running makes us look guilty, makes Medicine Woman look like she betrayed her own people." Margaret felt her world spinning as she faced an impossible choice. If the Apache fled, it would confirm military suspicions about her collaboration with hostiles, likely resulting in charges that could see her imprisoned or executed for treason. But if they remained, the arriving force would almost certainly treat them as enemy combatants, leading to a firefight that could destroy everything they'd built over the past 3 days. "The boy's right," she said slowly, watching the approaching dust cloud grow larger. "Running now destroys everything we've tried to accomplish." Grey Wolf's expression showed he understood the logic even as he disagreed with the conclusion. "Sometimes survival matters more than principle, Medicine Woman. Dead people cannot build peace between peoples." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and Margaret could now make out individual riders in the torchlight. At the column's head rode a figure she recognized with sinking heart. Brigadier General Marcus Crook, territorial commander whose reputation for harsh treatment of Apache resistance was legendary throughout the Southwest. "General Crook," she breathed, "this won't be a diplomatic conversation." Swift-Running Fox looked between the adults, reading the fear in their expressions despite their attempts to remain calm. "Who is this man?" "Someone who believes that the only way to handle Apache resistance is through overwhelming force," Margaret replied grimly. "He's been advocating for total war against your people for months." Grey Wolf's hand moved unconsciously toward his weapons before he caught himself, remembering that violence would only confirm Crook's worst assumptions about Apache intentions. "Then we face a test of everything we have learned about each other. Can friendship survive when authority demands hatred?" The question hung in the morning air as 30 cavalry soldiers formed a battle line facing Margaret's ranch. Behind them came a dozen civilians, armed settlers whose faces reflected the fear and anger that had driven them to join this expedition. Margaret recognized several neighbors, including the Patterson family from the next valley and old Samuel Henderson, the prospector whose homestead lay 20 miles south. General Crook dismounted with theatrical precision, his imposing frame, commanding in full-dress uniform, complete with ceremonial sword. His steel-gray hair and harsh features made him look like a figure carved from desert stone, uncompromising and severe. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Mrs. Margaret Thompson," he announced formally, "by order of the Territorial Governor and the United States Army, you are under arrest for providing aid and comfort to enemy combatants in direct violation of federal law." Margaret felt as though the desert had opened beneath her feet. Military arrest meant court-martial, military justice, and almost certain conviction, given the current political climate surrounding Apache relations. But before she could respond, another voice cut through the morning air with unexpected authority. "General Crook!" Lieutenant Colonel Morrison emerged from behind the ranch house, where he'd been inspecting the damage from the mountain lion's assault. "I need to speak with you about the actual circumstances here." Crook's eyes narrowed as he recognized his subordinate. "Colonel Morrison, I ordered you to report back to Fort Benton 3 days ago. Your failure to do so will be addressed through appropriate channels." "Sir, with respect, the situation here required continued observation to ensure accurate reporting." Morrison replied, moving to stand beside Margaret in a gesture that spoke volumes about loyalties shaped by shared danger. Or what we discovered contradicts initial intelligence assessments. Are you questioning military intelligence, Colonel? I'm reporting facts that intelligence failed to uncover, sir. Morrison's voice remained respectful, but firm. The Apache presence here was a family rescue mission, not hostile reconnaissance. Mrs. Thompson provided medical aid to a wounded child, nothing more. Crook's laugh was harsh and dismissive. And you believed their deceptions, Colonel. You've been away from civilization too long if you think these savages are capable of genuine family sentiment. Margaret watched Grey Wolf's face during this exchange, seeing how carefully he controlled his reaction to Crook's casual dehumanization. The Apache leader understood that any display of anger would be interpreted as confirmation of savage nature, undermining everything they'd tried to accomplish. The boy was genuinely injured, Margaret interjected, attacked by a mountain lion, bleeding, nearly unconscious when I found him. What was I supposed to do? Let a child die to satisfy political policy? You were supposed to report the presence of hostiles to proper authorities, Crook snapped. Instead, you chose to harbor enemies of the United States, providing them with intelligence about military movements and civilian vulnerabilities in this territory. The accusation was so far from reality that Margaret felt momentarily speechless. But before she could formulate a response, swift-running Fox stepped forward despite his uncle's restraining hand. I tell you the truth, the boy said with quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with Crook's harsh demeanor. Medicine woman saved my life when Mountain Cat tried to kill me. She cleaned wounds, gave food, protected me from soldiers who wanted to hurt wounded child. She is good person, not enemy of anyone. Crook's eyes fixed on swift-running Fox with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. And you, young savage, are exactly the kind of decoy these people use to infiltrate civilized communities. How many white families has your tribe murdered while you played the innocent victim? General, Morrison interrupted before the situation could escalate further. The boy's injuries were genuine. I examined them myself, along with the dead mountain lion that inflicted them. No one could fake wounds that severe or stage a predator attack of that magnitude. Physical evidence can be manipulated by those cunning enough to understand how Christian sympathy can be exploited, Crook replied coldly. These people are more intelligent than you credit, Colonel. They understand exactly how to manipulate appearances to serve their strategic objectives. Margaret realized with growing horror that Crook had already decided on his version of events before arriving at her ranch. No amount of evidence or testimony would change his predetermined narrative about savage deception and white victimization. But Grey Wolf chose that moment to step forward, moving with the fluid grace that marked him as comfortable with violence while choosing restraint. When he spoke, his English carried formal cadences that suggested education and intelligence, challenging every stereotype. General Crook, he said with quiet dignity, I am Grey Wolf, war chief of the Chiricahua band. The boy you accuse of deception is my son, lost for 2 days in desert during hunting expedition. This woman found him dying and chose mercy over fear. For this, she has earned eternal gratitude of my people. Crook's face flushed with anger at being addressed directly by an Apache leader. I don't negotiate with hostiles. Your very presence here constitutes an act of war against the United States. My presence here constitutes an act of gratitude towards someone who saved family, Grey Wolf replied calmly. Among my people, such debts are sacred. They cannot be ignored for political convenience. The exchange was drawing lines that would determine everything that followed. Margaret recognized that she was witnessing a crucial moment where individual choices would either advance understanding or confirm the inevitability of continued warfare. Henderson, the old prospector, stepped forward from the group of civilians. "General, sir, what about the mountain lion they killed together? Colonel Morrison told us how soldiers and Apache worked together to bring down a predator that threatened everyone. Doesn't that cooperation count for something?" Margaret felt a surge of hope as she realized not all the civilians had come seeking confrontation. Some, like Henderson, seemed genuinely interested in understanding what had actually transpired, rather than confirming preconceived notions. Crook's expression hardened further. Temporary cooperation against a common threat doesn't erase fundamental antagonisms. These people remain enemies of civilization, regardless of momentary tactical alliances. "With respect, sir," Morrison interjected, "the cooperation I witnessed went beyond tactical necessity. It demonstrated shared values that transcend cultural boundaries." "Colonel Morrison," Crook's voice carried the chill of military discipline about to be enforced, "you will be silent until I request your input. Your judgment has clearly been compromised by prolonged exposure to hostile propaganda." The dismissal of Morrison's first-hand observations struck Margaret as fundamentally unjust. The colonel had witnessed everything that transpired, yet his testimony was being rejected simply because it contradicted predetermined conclusions. Grey Wolf seemed to recognize the futility of reasoned argument with Crook. Instead, he turned to address the assembled civilians directly, speaking with the formal dignity of a chief addressing a tribal council. "People of this territory," he said clearly, "I came here to recover my wounded son. Nothing more. Found him saved by a woman with healing spirit who asked nothing in return for kindness. This is not enemy behavior. This is sacred behavior that my people honor above all else." Mrs. Patterson, a stern woman whose family had suffered losses during previous Apache raids, studied Grey Wolf with suspicious eyes. "How do we know this isn't elaborate deception? How do we know you're not scouting our weaknesses while pretending?" Gratitude. The question went to the heart of frontier anxiety, the persistent fear that kindness would be repaid with violence. Margaret understood that Mrs. Patterson's suspicion grew from genuine loss and trauma, making her distrust both logical and tragic. Grey Wolf met her gaze directly. "Because if my people wanted to attack this valley, we would not announce our presence or engage in lengthy conversations with armed soldiers. We would strike before dawn and disappear into desert before you knew we were here." His blunt honesty about Apache military capabilities sent a ripple of unease through the assembled civilians. But Margaret recognized the wisdom in his approach, acknowledging rather than denying Apache's strength while emphasizing their choice to use that strength for protection rather than aggression. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the desert air into shimmering waves of heat that made the confrontation feel even more surreal. Margaret realized that the next few moments would determine whether the bridge between peoples would be strengthened or burned in the flames of predetermined hatred. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring in the desert heat, with 30 armed soldiers facing 5 Apache warriors, while civilians and commanders wrestled with competing versions of reality. Margaret could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge, knowing that the next word spoken might determine whether understanding triumphed over prejudice or whether blood would stain the desert sand. Then Henderson, the grizzled prospector, asked the question that cut through all the political rhetoric. "General, if these Apache are as dangerous as you claim, why haven't they killed us all by now? They've had 3 days with Mrs. Thompson, opportunity to learn everything about our defenses. If they're really advanced scouts, where are the war parties?" The question struck at the heart of Crook's narrative logic. Margaret watched the general struggle to formulate a response that maintained his position while addressing obvious contradictions in his theory. "Their plans may simply require more time to develop," Crook replied, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Or maybe, Henderson continued relentlessly, drawing on decades of frontier experience, they're telling the truth about being here for family reasons. Maybe sometimes things are exactly what they appear to be. Other civilians were nodding now, their practical knowledge of desert survival aligning with Henderson's common-sense assessment. Margaret felt hope stirring as she realized that ordinary people might prove more open to evidence than military authority blinded by ideology. Private Martinez, one of Morrison's original patrol, stepped forward from the cavalry ranks with the courage of someone who'd witnessed events firsthand. "General, sir, I was here during the mountain lion attack. I saw how those Apache warriors coordinated with us to protect everyone, not just their own people." Crook's eyes blazed with fury at this challenge to his authority from subordinate ranks. "Private Martinez, return to formation immediately. Your observations are not relevant to command decisions." "But, sir," Martinez persisted with youthful determination to speak truth to power, "shouldn't what actually happened matter more than what we expected to happen?" The question crystallized the fundamental conflict between predetermined ideology and observed reality. Margaret could see other soldiers shifting uncomfortably as their first-hand knowledge conflicted with official doctrine in ways that challenged everything they'd been taught about Apache capabilities and intentions. Gray. Wolf recognized the opening that Martinez's courage had created. Rather than addressing Crook directly, he spoke to the assembled group with the voice of someone offering wisdom earned through hard experience. "In my 50 winters, I have seen much war between Apache and white soldiers. Always it begins same way. Fear of other, belief that difference means danger, but sometimes wise people choose to see past fear to truth underneath." He gestured toward Margaret and swift-running Fox, uncle and son united by shared ordeal. Medicine woman chose to see wounded child instead of enemy warrior. My son chose to trust healing instead of harboring hatred. Colonel Morrison chose to believe evidence instead of expectations. These choices created something new, something that offers hope for better future. The simple dignity of his words created a moment of profound silence in the desert morning. Margaret realized that Grey Wolf was offering everyone present a choice between familiar patterns of conflict and uncertain possibilities of peace. But Crook broke the silence with harsh laughter. Pretty words from a savage trying to avoid consequences. Of his aggression, I deal in facts, not feelings. Mrs. Thompson harbored enemy combatants. These Apache trespassed on American territory. Military law is clear about appropriate responses. Margaret felt desperation rising as reason and evidence proved powerless against ideological certainty. Crook represented everything that made frontier peace impossible. The inability to see humanity in designated enemies, the refusal to acknowledge complexity in situations defined as simple, the insistence on military solutions to problems that required human understanding. But then Mrs. Patterson spoke again, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived frontier hardships through practical wisdom rather than theoretical knowledge. "General, I lost my husband and brother to Apache raids 3 years ago. I came here expecting to find proof of treachery that would justify revenge." She paused, looking directly at Grey Wolf and swift-running Fox. "But what I'm seeing doesn't match what you told us to expect. I see a father who traveled dangerous country to rescue his lost child, and a boy who's grateful to the woman who saved his life. That's not savage deception. That's family love." Her words carried enormous weight, precisely because they came from someone who had every reason to hate Apache people. Margaret watched Crook's certainty wavering as his own supporters began questioning his narrative. Swift-running Fox, despite his healing wounds and obvious weakness, stepped forward to address Mrs. Patterson directly. "I am sorry for your losses," he said with formal gravity that belied his youth. War brings pain to all peoples, but Medicine Woman showed me that healing is also possible when people choose kindness over hatred. The boy's simple eloquence seemed to affect everyone present, including some of Crook's soldiers who were seeing Apache humanity for the first time in their military careers. Margaret realized that Swift-Running Fox's youth and obvious sincerity made him a more effective advocate for peace than any adult diplomat could be. Henderson seized on the moment of uncertainty. "General, I've got another question. You say these Apache are here to scout for attacks, but they've been helping Mrs. Thompson with ranch work for 3 days. Grey Wolf and his men helped repair the damage from the mountain lion, fixed her water pump, and even shared their knowledge about finding better pasture for her cattle. That sound like enemy reconnaissance to you?" The revelation struck Margaret as particularly powerful because it addressed practical concerns that frontier settlers understood. Apache warriors sharing technical knowledge and providing manual labor contradicted every stereotype about savage laziness and incompetence. Morrison stepped forward to support Henderson's observations. "General, I've been documenting everything that's transpired here. The Apache warriors demonstrated skills and knowledge that could benefit every rancher in this territory. They know water sources we've never found, understand weather patterns that could prevent livestock losses, and possess medical knowledge that saved this boy's life." "Medical knowledge," Crook repeated dismissively. "You mean primitive superstitions and savage remedies?" "I mean effective treatment that prevented infection and promoted healing," Margaret interjected firmly. "Grey Wolf's wife taught me techniques for treating wounds that work better than anything in my medical books. Knowledge is knowledge, General, regardless of who possesses it." The exchange was revealing fundamental philosophical differences about the nature of civilization and progress. Margaret could see that some civilians were beginning to recognize the value of indigenous knowledge that official policy dismissed as worthless superstition. But Crook's next words showed how deeply his prejudices ran. "Mrs. Thompson, you've clearly been seduced by savage lies designed to make their primitive culture appear equal to Christian civilization. This is exactly the kind of thinking that leads to the destruction of everything we've worked to build in this territory." Grey Wolf's response carried quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with Crook's harsh rhetoric. "General, Apache people do not claim our ways are better than yours. We claim only that they work for us, just as your ways work for you. But when Apache child is dying, Apache medicine and white medicine both try to save life. When mountain lion threatens all people, Apache arrows and soldier bullets both try to kill danger. Maybe wisdom comes from using whatever works, instead of arguing about who discovered it first." The Apache leader's words struck at the heart of frontier pragmatism that valued results over ideology. Margaret could see nods of approval from civilians who understood that survival in harsh country required borrowing the best ideas from any available source. Private Carson, another member of Morrison's original patrol, added his voice to the growing chorus of support. "General, sir, when that mountain lion was trying to get into this house, I didn't care if the arrows helping us came from Apache or cavalry bows. I was just grateful for the help." Crook's face had turned dangerous shades of red as his subordinates continued challenging his authority. "I will have order in this command. Any further insubordination will result in immediate court-martial proceedings." But the damage was done. Seeds of doubt had been planted in minds that had witnessed events contradicting official narratives. Margaret could see the internal struggle playing out across multiple faces as good soldiers wrestled with conflicting loyalties between military discipline and observed truth. The desert sun climbed higher, turning the air itself into something that shimmered with heat and possibility. In that crucible moment, Margaret realized that individual courage was proving stronger than institutional power. that witness truth was more compelling than official fiction. The tide was turning, but the final outcome remained balanced on decisions yet to be made by people who would choose between the familiar comfort of hatred and the uncertain promise of understanding. The moment crystallized in the desert heat, like water turning to steam, all possibilities converging on a single point where the future would be decided by choices made in the next few heartbeats. General Crook stood isolated in his certainty, while growing numbers of soldiers and civilians aligned themselves with a truth that contradicted everything official policy had taught them about Apache-white relations. Then, cutting through the tension like a knife through silk, came the sound that would transform everything. The rhythmic thunder of a single horse approaching at desperate speed across the hard-pan desert floor. All eyes turned toward the dust cloud rising in the distance as a lone rider pushed his mount to its limits in the crushing heat. The horseman who emerged from the shimmering air wore the uniform of a cavalry courier, his lathered horse foam-flecked and trembling from exertion. He dismounted with the urgency of someone carrying news that couldn't wait for formal protocol. "General Crook, sir," he gasped, snapping to attention despite his obvious exhaustion. "Priority dispatch from Washington, sir. Orders from the Secretary of War himself." Crook's face darkened as he accepted the sealed envelope, clearly annoyed at having his confrontation interrupted by bureaucratic interference from distant officials who couldn't possibly understand frontier realities. But military discipline demanded that he read dispatches from his superiors, regardless of timing. Margaret watched the general's expression cycle through surprise, confusion, and barely controlled rage as he absorbed the contents of the message. When he looked up, his eyes held the fury of a man whose worldview was being systematically dismantled by forces beyond his control. "It appears," he said through gritted teeth, "that certain parties in Washington have taken an interest in reports of successful cooperation between military units and Apache tribes in this territory. The Secretary of War is curious about the potential for what he terms alternative approaches to indigenous relations." The courier, emboldened by his role as messenger from higher authority, added details that made Crook's situation even more precarious. "Sir, the Secretary specifically mentioned reports of a cavalry officer named Morrison who demonstrated exceptional judgment in coordinating with Apache warriors to protect civilian lives. There's talk of promoting such innovative thinking throughout the territorial command structure." Morrison's face showed his shock at being mentioned in dispatches from Washington. Margaret realized that someone, somewhere in the military hierarchy, had been paying attention to unconventional approaches that achieved results through cooperation rather than conflict. But the courier wasn't finished delivering news that would reshape everything. "General, there's more. A delegation of Apache chiefs is en route to Fort Benton for peace negotiations. They specifically requested that the officer involved in the mountain lion incident be present for discussions about establishing protected zones where both peoples can interact safely." The revelation struck everyone present, like lightning illuminating a midnight landscape. Margaret understood that their small drama in the desert had somehow attracted attention at the highest levels of government, transforming local decisions into matters of national policy. Grey Wolf stepped forward with the dignity of someone who'd anticipated this development. "General Crook, the Apache nation is tired of war that brings only death to our children and your soldiers. When we heard that white officer and Apache warriors fought side by side to protect wounded child, our chiefs saw possibility for different future." He gestured toward swift-running Fox, who, despite his healing wounds, stood straighter with pride at being part of something historically significant. "My son has become bridge between peoples who forgot how to trust each other. Medicine Woman who saved his life has shown that mercy is stronger than hatred when brave people choose to practice it." Henderson, the old prospector, laughed with the relief of someone who'd lived through too many senseless conflicts. Well, I'll be damned. Seems like doing the right thing sometimes gets noticed by folks who matter. But Crook wasn't ready to surrender his position without a final attempt. To maintain military authority, orders from Washington don't change the facts on the ground. These Apache remain potential threats regardless of political convenience. His words rang hollow now, undermined by evidence that contradicted his assumptions and testimony from his own subordinates who'd witnessed cooperation rather than hostility. Margaret could see that Crook's rigid ideology was crumbling under the weight of practical results that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Morrison seized the moment to formally challenge his superior's judgment. "General, with all due respect, the facts on the ground support exactly the opposite conclusion. Apache cooperation has provided security and knowledge that conventional military approaches failed to achieve. Mrs. Thompson's ranch has become a demonstration that peace is possible when people choose understanding over conflict." Mrs. Patterson nodded in agreement, her earlier suspicions transformed by witnessed evidence. "My family lost people to Apache raids, but what I've seen here isn't the savage treachery we were told to expect. It's family loyalty and human decency that transcends tribal boundaries." Swift, running Fox, emboldened by the adult support surrounding him, addressed the assembled group with wisdom that belied his youth. In Apache stories, grandmother taught that enemies become friends when they discover shared hopes for their children's future. White children and Apache children both need protection from dangers that threaten all families: mountain lions, drought, sickness, hunger. Maybe adults fight about land and politics, but children just want to grow up safe and strong. The boy's simple observation struck at fundamental truths that political rhetoric obscured. Margaret realized that swift-running Fox had articulated something that experienced diplomats and military officers had failed to grasp: that human needs transcended cultural differences when people focused on commonalities rather than divisions. Private Martinez stepped forward to add his voice to the growing chorus of support. "General, that boy saved my life during the mountain lion attack. He warned me when the cat was positioning for another spring. Enemy combatants don't risk themselves to protect soldiers who've been hunting them." The testimony from his own troops was undermining Crook's authority more effectively than any Apache argument could have. Margaret watched the general's isolation become complete as even his most loyal subordinates witnessed truth over official doctrine. But the transformation wasn't limited to military personnel. The civilian settlers who'd accompanied Crook's expedition were experiencing their own revelations about Apache capabilities and intentions. Samuel Henderson voiced what many were thinking. "General, I've been fighting Apache for 20 years. And I thought I understood what they were capable of, but I never saw them demonstrate the kind of technical knowledge and cooperative spirit that Grey Wolf's people have shown here. Maybe it's time to consider whether we've been fighting the wrong battle." Grey Wolf recognized the historical significance of this moment. For many generations, Apache people have watched white settlers take land, kill buffalo, pollute streams, and drive away game that fed our families. We fought because fighting seemed like only choice for survival. But Medicine Woman showed different path where helping each other makes both people stronger than fighting each other makes us weak. His words carried the weight of generational wisdom earned through centuries of adaptation to harsh environments that demanded cooperation for survival. Margaret realized that Apache culture had always understood principles of mutual aid that white society was only beginning to rediscover through necessity. The courier from Washington provided the final piece of information that would cement the transformation. "General Crook, I'm instructed to inform you that the territorial governor has endorsed the establishment of peace zones where cooperative Arrangements between Apache bands and white settlers can be developed and tested. Mrs. Thompson's ranch has been designated as the first official site for such experimentation. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet as she realized that her simple choice to shelter an injured boy had somehow become the foundation for official policy changes that could affect thousands of lives. The weight of responsibility was staggering, but so was the potential for positive transformation. Crook made one final attempt to maintain his position. This sets a dangerous precedent. Military discipline and territorial security cannot be subordinated to humanitarian sentiment, but Morrison had found his voice and his courage. "General, what we've demonstrated here isn't the subordination of military objectives to sentiment. It's the achievement of military objectives through superior methods. Apache cooperation has provided intelligence, tactical support, and local knowledge that conventional operations failed to obtain. Results matter more than ideology." The Colonel's words reflected a pragmatic military philosophy that valued effectiveness over doctrine. Margaret could see approval in the faces of soldiers who'd learned to respect Apache capabilities through direct experience rather than prejudicial assumptions. As the morning sun climbed toward its zenith, transforming the desert air into waves of shimmering heat, the confrontation resolved itself through the simple power of accumulated truth overcoming predetermined fiction. Crook found himself commanding an expedition whose members had witnessed evidence that contradicted his fundamental assumptions about Apache nature and capabilities. Grey Wolf stepped forward to formalize what everyone understood had occurred. "General Crook, Apache people offer hand of friendship to those who choose friendship over warfare. Sacred obligation created when soldiers helped protect my son extends to all who honor that choice. Medicine Woman will always be safe under Apache protection, and those who treat her with respect earn same protection." The offer represented something unprecedented in frontier history, Apache tribal commitment to protecting white settlers, who demonstrated good faith in their interactions with indigenous peoples. Margaret realized that the sacred obligation Grey Wolf described could become the foundation for security arrangements that transcended military force. Henderson seized on the practical implications. "General, that's better than any treaty Washington ever negotiated. Apache protection is worth more than a company of cavalry when you're dealing with the kind of dangers we face out here." Morrison nodded in agreement. "Sir, from a purely military standpoint, Allied Apache scouts and fighters represent force multiplication that conventional recruitment couldn't achieve. They know terrain, weather patterns, and tactical approaches that took our military years to learn through bitter experience. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a military expedition to arrest a woman for harboring enemy combatants had become a demonstration of how cooperation could achieve objectives that conflict had failed to accomplish. Margaret stood at the center of a historical shift that would influence frontier relations for generations to come. Swift-running Fox, despite his healing wounds, approached each of the soldiers who'd helped defend him from the mountain lion. "Thank you for choosing to protect Apache child when protecting brought danger to yourselves. This choice makes you brothers in my family, welcome in Apache camps, safe under Apache law." The formal adoption ceremony, conducted in halting English, but with unmistakable sincerity, created bonds that transcended military regulations and territorial boundaries. Margaret watched hardened soldiers accepting familial relationships with people they'd been trained to consider subhuman enemies. As the heat of midday settled over the desert landscape, the various groups began making preparations for departure. But these weren't the hasty retreats of defeated armies or the triumphant marches of conquering forces. These were the careful arrangements of people who discovered that cooperation required ongoing commitment and continuous effort. Crook, isolated, in his ideological defeat but still commanding officer, made the decision that preserved his career while acknowledging changed realities. Colonel Morrison, you'll remain here to oversee the establishment of this experimental arrangement. I'll be returning to Fort Benton to report on developments and await further instructions from Washington. The general's graceless acceptance of new circumstances wasn't ideal, but it cleared the way for practical implementation of cooperative arrangements that could prove the value of peaceful coexistence. Margaret realized that Crook's withdrawal removed the primary obstacle to success. Grey Wolf gathered his warriors for consultation in rapid Apache, their discussion animated but respectful as they considered commitments and possibilities that would shape their band's future. When he returned, his expression reflected the gravity of decisions that would bind his people for generations. Apache warriors will return to our main camp to share news of what has happened here. But 3 of my best men will remain to help establish protections that keep Medicine Woman safe and demonstrate that Apache promises have meaning. This is first step toward larger peace that benefits all peoples. The commitment represented exactly the kind of good faith gesture that could build trust between communities that had learned to expect betrayal and violence. Margaret felt hope stirring that transcended her personal situation to encompass possibilities for entire populations. Henderson spoke for the civilian settlers who'd witnessed these unprecedented developments. Mrs. Thompson, if this arrangement works out, you'll have neighbors lining up to learn how to make it work on their properties too. Peace is good for business, and good business is good for everyone. The practical observation reflected frontier pragmatism that valued results over theoretical principles. Margaret realized that economic incentives could prove as powerful as humanitarian motivations in spreading cooperative arrangements throughout the territory. As the various groups prepared for their respective journeys, swift-running Fox approached, Margaret with shy gratitude that encompassed everything that had transpired since his desperate arrival at her ranch. Medicine Woman, you saved more than my life when you chose to help wounded Apache boy. You saved possibility for peace between our peoples. His words carried weight disproportionate to his years, reflecting wisdom earned through suffering that had been transformed into hope through the kindness of strangers who chose to see humanity rather than tribal identity. Margaret knelt to his level, her voice gentle but firm. Swift-running Fox, you saved more than you know by choosing to trust me with your pain. Sometimes healing requires risks that seem impossible until brave people decide they're necessary. The exchange crystallized everything that had made their unlikely alliance possible. The willingness to extend trust across cultural boundaries, the choice to see potential rather than threat, the courage to act on humanitarian instincts despite political consequences. As the sun reached its zenith and cast short shadows on the desert floor, Margaret stood on her porch, watching former enemies depart as friends and allies. The mountain lion that had driven these events was already becoming carrion for buzzards, but its attack had catalyzed transformations that would echo through history. 3 days had proven sufficient to demonstrate that peace was possible when people chose courage over fear, mercy over military doctrine, and understanding over ideological certainty. The boy she'd sheltered from a predator had become the foundation for arrangements that offered hope to entire peoples trapped in cycles of violence that benefited no one. The desert wind continued to blow across the landscape, but now it carried with it the scent of possibilities that seemed impossible just days before. Margaret Thompson had chosen to protect an Apache boy from a mountain lion, and 3 days later, Apache elders were protecting her homestead and everything it represented about the power of individual courage to change the course of history. In The shimmering heat of the Arizona desert, enemies had discovered they could become family when survival demanded cooperation and healing proved stronger than hatred. The bridge between worlds had been built one act of mercy at a time, proving that the most profound transformations often began with the simplest choices made by ordinary people who refused to accept that peace was impossible. The legacy would endure long after those who'd created it had passed into legend, a testament to the truth that individual acts of courage could indeed reshape the destiny of nations when brave people chose love over fear in moments that mattered most. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.